Good evening, everyone. I'm Don Gordon. I'm the Executive Director of the Riley Institute. And for the Riley Institute, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, and our partners at South Carolina ETV, welcome to the third and final night of Straight Talk 2021. Tonight, dismantling racism, why now is the moment for change. I have to tell you, I really am excited about tonight because currently we're in a state and a nation that is looking at perhaps one of the greatest opportunities for building a stronger community set since the New Deal. We have the chance tonight to consider how being intentional in making decisions at the local and state level about how we invest will ensure we build a more inclusive society that works for every one of us. Now, if you joined us in our first session on August the 31st, you heard how our country's history since its founding has resulted in a society that actually benefits some at the expense of others. Even though none of us has ever been enslaved or enslaved anybody, our current stories still are impacted by our shared history of slavery. We are also enduring the legacy of decades of acts of terror by individuals toward their fellow Americans, and decades of laws and policies that have denied some Americans the opportunities for home ownership, for good public education, for Social Security, and even for a neighborhood swimming pool. It is clear that we have big problems in our country, big problems to solve, and the core of many of our issues is structural racism. If you listen to Heather Matthews and Dick Riley, Heather McGee and Dick Riley last week, you likely understood that it is better for all of us if we're working on this together to solve this issue. It is only through solidarity that we can effect lasting change. And as we heard last week from our panel of local leaders, there's a lot of committed people out there who are hoping and working to do just that. Tonight, we want to bring all of these understandings to bear on as we embark on this journey to consider what is next. As you listen to our keynote speaker and our discussants, we invite you to submit questions for our speakers. Please note that the link in your program and on the screen, if you'd like to ask questions, please click on Submit a Question for our speakers and hit that button. During the last few minutes of the program, SET's Gavin Jackson will ask our panelists a few of the questions that you submit. But before we hear from Gavin and our panelists, we have the great honor of hearing remarks from nationally recognized speaker and racial equality advocate Angela Glover Blackwell. Angela is joining us from California, where she is founder in residence of PolicyLink, an organization with a mission of advancing racial and economic equity for all of us. Angela is also the host of Radical Imagination podcast and teaches a course in race and public policy at the University of California at Berkeley. She seeks to use public policy to help us become a better country by giving all Americans a chance to participate and to prosper. We are so fortunate to have her speak this evening. Angela, welcome, and thank you for being part of this program.
Thank you so much, Gavin. It is certainly my honor to speak at the Riley Institute at Furman University. Like so many of you who believe that local leaders are national leaders because they're the ones who are solving the nation's problems, and who understand that the creativity and commitment and the initiative taking in local communities is really what fuels our imaginations to do better and be better, you have to be a fan of Richard Riley. I certainly have been throughout my career. And I am pleased to have this opportunity to talk on this important topic. It is so heartwarming to hear the review of what you have already talked about, because too many people in this country just don't know the history. Some don't want to know it, but many who would love to know what is it that we stand upon? Just don't know the history. And so talking to a group of people who have reviewed how slavery and Reconstruction and Jim Crow and the Great Migration and deep segregation have had such a profound impact on the country, that investment and disinvestment in Black communities have just left such an extraordinary legacy of suffering that needs to be addressed. And to follow the amazing leadership and accomplishments from the civil rights movement, and to have to just swallow the truth that getting rid of the laws that were perpetuating discrimination did not stop discrimination, did not stop suffering, did not eliminate racism, because it had become baked into society, baked into the culture, baked into the very institutions that sometimes were charged with trying to address the problems. But if the people running them didn't believe in those who they were supposed to be investing in, it just wouldn't make a difference. If the institutional structures weren't designed to really move forward, it wouldn't make a difference. And so joining this conversation while you've already talked about that fills my heart with hope. But also you've gone beyond that and you've actually looked at what it means to set up a society that systematically, intentionally, and then through structures has baked in inequality. It hurts everybody. It hurts everybody when you're not tapping the full potential of the nation for the nation. It hurts everybody when you have systems that aren't really designed to move people forward, but hold them down. And then everybody in need has to participate in that system. It hurts everybody when you claim to be the world's leading democracy, but you don't even have to look closely to see that the democracy is not working in the way that true democracy works. Because true democracy actually is measured with how those who are most vulnerable are treated within it. We have the opportunity to actually build a multiracial democracy, and that is an exciting moment, because what we know is not only is everybody hurt when a huge swath of the population is left behind, but when we finally achieve equity, racial equity, everybody benefits. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, how public policy and investment can lead to transformative change. What a moment. What a moment. I have been an advocate for racial justice for over 50 years. And in those 50 years, I have never seen a moment like this one. I grew up in the civil rights movement. I came of age coming out of college into the Black Power movement. I participated in the anti-war movement. And I worked at philanthropy. I've worked as an organizer. I've worked as a public interest lawyer and a community builder at foundations, and now as a policy advocate. And I've never seen a moment as ripe for change as this one, because it's filled with so much truth, as people have really come to a racial reckoning. And while everybody hasn't come there, more people than I've ever seen have. More institutions and corporations, whether they're universities or Fortune 500 businesses or civic organizations or governors associations, many people are recognizing that we don't have forever to solve the racial problems in this country. And this moment actually is pushing us to do it now. But it's not just a moment where resolve is bubbling up. It's a moment in which there's so much readiness. We have so many people leading institutions who are deeply familiar with the suffering that has happened in low-income communities of color around the country. We have so many people in leadership positions in philanthropy and other places, wealthy individuals who are bringing forward their resources to put it with those who have been working for change, to make sure that it's not absence of resources. That absence of resources will not keep them from doing what they have known for a long time that we need to do. And we have a definition of equity that many people are using: just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. That equity definition, this moment of trying to achieve racial equity, is distinct from equality. Equality was certainly a good thing to work for, and we certainly haven't achieved it, and we'd certainly be in a better position today if we had. But when you think about it, given the legacy that you've been talking about over the series of conversations, given the institutional and structural racism that has functioned, mere equality on the input side won't solve the problem. Often when people talk about equality, what they're referring to is what are the inputs? In education, trying to make sure that children are going to school for the same amount of time over the course of the year, that teachers have similar preparation, that the curriculum and the books are the same books, that we actually have art and swimming and the things that young people can learn to do in schools. That's the input conversation. But you know, after you've had the decades upon decades of disadvantage and suffering that has happened in this country to people who are Black and brown, just trying to equalize the inputs won't get to the outcomes that we're talking about. In education, that means reaching your full potential, graduating, being able to actually do what you want to do in the world. If you say that what we want for all children is an education that allows them to graduate, go on to higher education and jobs and reach their full potential, the inputs may be very different. Once you state the outcome, you back into the inputs. And some children are going to need more, and we know they do, because the communities lack the support that they needed, because their parents don't have the education to be able to help them, because the expectations of them have been so different. They're going to have different inputs to be able to get to an equitable outcome. And we're having that conversation. But not only are we having that conversation, but we have come to understand that you have to have a lot of data and knowledge to be able to understand how to get to that part of the population that has been most discriminated against, most marginalized, made most vulnerable, been most targeted. Because when you get there, as painful it is to have to admit that society could have been doing that to people, but when you get there, and that becomes where you focus to try to think about how are we going to solve the problems of the larger society, we actually end up benefiting everybody. I call it the curb cut effect. And you know about curb cuts. They are those cutouts in the sidewalk that are there because of the advocacy of people with disabilities in wheelchairs. But we all benefit from them, whether you're pushing a baby carriage or whether you're pulling a wagon, pushing a cart. It even saves lives because 9 out of 10 unencumbered adults cross the street at the corner because of the orientation of the curb cut. It is an example of how when we go to the most vulnerable with nuance and specificity about their needs in the problem solving effort, we end up coming up with solutions that benefit everybody. Once you know what you're looking for, it's easy to find because they're every place. I'll just give 2 quick examples. One is not smoking in public places. That started because of the advocacy of flight attendants who, because of smoking on the airplanes, were suffering greatly. Just having a no smoking section did not solve their problem. But when those flight attendants joined up with Ralph Nader, that famous consumer advocate, and they were able to get a ban on smoking on airplanes. That led to the movement to ban smoking in public places. Millions of lives have probably been saved because of that. The other thing I want to point out is the GI Bill, which I often refer to as the would-be gold standard of the curb cut effect. Would be because it was implemented in a discriminatory fashion, and many people who were Black were left out of the full benefits. But it was started, written on the back of a napkin, to try to think about the 100,000, perhaps, service people returning from World War II out of the 16 million returning who might need a little extra effort to get integrated back into community. About 100,000 people they thought would need it. Well, it turned out that 8 million took advantage of the educational component and many more millions took advantage of the home ownership opportunities. It is no exaggeration to say that it was a big contribution to making the white middle class. Focus, with nuance and specificity on those who have been made most vulnerable, and everybody benefits. And so we're entering this conversation at a time when we're understanding that, and we hadn't really been thinking about that before. So what can we do? We can finally achieve racial equity. And when we do, what will it look like? Well, all communities will be communities of opportunity. Every place will actually have the access to healthy food, the access to transportation, the safety, the greenness, the safe and affordable housing that's needed. All communities will be communities of opportunity. All can participate in an inclusive economy and be able to pursue work and careers and entrepreneurial opportunities. And all individuals will be able to reach their full potential. Being able to do that, however, is going to take intentionality. We know the history. We know the consequences. We know that we're all suffering. We know that we would all benefit. We know what it would look like. Now we have to think about how we have to do it. But what we have to do is to be explicit. We have to name racial equity as the goal. We have to just say it. That in the spending of these resources, in the implementation of these initiatives, we want to achieve racial equity with specific targets. Do the data analysis. Look at who's in your community, who's indigenous, who's Latino, who's African American, who's being left behind, where do they live, how big is the gap, what do they need? Be explicit about how many people are going to be served in 10 years and how many people are going to be served in 6 months, and measure your progress against that. Some people are using reparations as the way to get at that in places like Asheville and Evanston. And some people are just taking every opportunity to spend money, like the infrastructure dollars that will be coming into community. Lots of opportunities for jobs. How do we actually say, how does our infrastructure spending become our initiative for repair? How do we use it to be able to actually go forward with racial equity? Be explicit about naming it. Make sure that we're actually connecting people who are unemployed and low-wage workers to the job opportunities. We know who the people are who've been left behind. We know what their capacity is, and we know what it needs to be. And so let's invest in the education that people need, but also make sure that we're not just employing the usual suspects and hoping that some of those jobs will trickle down, but being explicit about hiring. They've done that in Oakland, California, where they were taking a Navy base that had been, Army base that had been just vacant for 25 years, turned it into a logistical center. But before they broke ground, a year before, they set up a job training program in the poorest community in Oakland to get people ready for those jobs. And they made sure that they focused on people who had been formerly incarcerated, people who were veterans, people who had been long-term unemployed. Actually make sure you're connecting people specifically to those kind of opportunities when you know they're coming about. Restore and expand public services and deliver the physical infrastructure, but also the job infrastructure and the care infrastructure that communities need. In New York City, for example, they started a city cleanup corps launched to directly create 10,000 jobs for beautifying with green the 33 neighborhoods that had been hardest hit by COVID. There are ways, once you set racial equity targets, to be able to use information that we've gained, sometimes sadly. COVID has been a sad way to gain information, but we've seen the communities that have been hit hardest. And we know they were hit hardest because of decades of discrimination that locked people out of healthcare, that locked people in communities with no places to exercise, access healthy food, away from toxins. And so use that information to be able to develop programs that actually restore the services that are needed and make sure that the people who have been there through the bad times are able to get those jobs. Speaking of living someplace during the bad times, one of the things we see happening all across this country is that when finally we do begin to bring back communities that have suffered for decades from disinvestment, the people who have been there through the bad times don't get to enjoy the improvements. Displacement, gentrification moves them out. So the housing crisis has become an emblematic of the racial crisis in America. The concentration of people in communities that were low income and suffering disinvestment, the services being lacking there, including school services and transportation services, We need to be able to make sure that every community is a community of opportunity, and fix that. But let's fix it for the people who are there. Too often when we decide to fix it, we fix the schools, we fix the roads, we make them pretty, and new people move in, and the people who were poor and needed a new place move out. Don't let that happen. Housing trust funds, housing land banks can all do that, and they're doing that all across the country. It's also important to make sure that we prioritize getting investments in the creative things that we're coming up with. In the introduction, it was mentioned that I have a podcast called Radical Imagination. And what I'm looking at is the initiatives that are really fueling change because people are imagining a different future. And one of the things that I've highlighted is a pilot program that started and stopped in California, but it's in Jackson, Mississippi, and Richmond, Virginia, and other places around the country, and that is guaranteed income. Having experiments in which people are just guaranteed a certain amount a month, $1,000 a month, $500 a month, and seeing what happens. Those guaranteed income programs are getting tremendous results, and we're seeing guaranteed income starting to happen at state level and other places. But that kind of experimentation, saying what kind of thing would make a difference? And while you might not start off with the money to do it for everybody, pilot it and publicize the pilot so people can see that we can do things differently. So much of what I've talked about is dependent on data. That has been disaggregated. You can't just look at unemployment data. You can't just look at poverty data and look across the board and say, oh, we're making improvements. Look, our poverty rate has gone down. Look, our employment rate is going up. You've got to disaggregate it and ask what's happening in the Black community. What's happening in the Black community for people who have less than a high school education? What's happening in that neighborhood where we have seen so much gang violence, where we've seen so much unemployment historically? We've got to disaggregate the data by gender, by race, by ethnicity, by geography, because having that disaggregated data is what allows us to be able to hold ourselves accountable for how it is that we're doing. That without that data, we can work on the problem, but you don't know whether or not you're really solving the problem. This is an extraordinary time, just an extraordinary time. And in conclusion, I want to just leave us with this challenge. We spend too much time thinking and looking at the past without connecting it, the knowledge and the insights to the future. We have many people in this country who are nostalgic for a time that never really was. When they say they want to go back to when everything was fine, it may have been fine for some, it may have been fine for many, but for too many, there was no opportunity for it to be fine. And so while that time may have shown some people in this country what a community of opportunity looks like, what it feels like when investments are big and generous, designed to be able to move millions of people into homes and infrastructure that allows them to be able to buy cars and stretch out. Can't be nostalgic for a time that never was. If you saw something good there, study it to figure out how do we make it good for everybody. And while some people are trying to be nostalgic for a time that never was, others are looking deeply at the past and looking for repair and healing and ownership of what really happened in the past that was this nation. That knowledge is only going to be helpful if we use it to commit to never again, never to anyone else, and to be cognizant of how much it's going to take to move forward. It's time to look to the future. The future can be bright. We know what it looks like. We know how to do it. What we lack is the political will and the public will to invest in what we know has to be. This country has become dependent on the very people who have been disproportionately left behind. As we become more and more diverse, we know that the fate of the nation is dependent on the very people who we have left behind. But what we also know is that if we roll up our sleeves and invest with creativity and commitment, remembering the curb cut effect, that the benefits will cascade up and out to everyone. Thank you.
Angela, thank you. That was fantastic. It's an exciting vision that we can all work to fulfill. And we look forward to hearing a lot more from you later on than today. But now welcome to the stage 3 of South's, the most interesting leaders in the South. John Simpkins, who is the CEO of MDC, a former Riley Institute Associate Director and Furman Professor and a Senior Fellow in the Riley Institute. Russell Booker, the former superintendent of Spartanburg District 7 school system, is now head of the Spartanburg Academic Magnet. And Gavin Jackson, the host of South Carolina's ETV's weekly public affairs show, This Week in South Carolina, and also the weekly South Carolina Lead podcast. Gavin, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Don. Thank you, everyone, for attending tonight. We're going to have a great panel here to discuss why now is a moment for change. And we heard some great stuff there from Angela. Now we're going to hear from our panelists on the stage here. I'm joined by John Simpkins and Dr. Russell Booker. We just heard a brief introduction from Don. But John, I want to have you kind of give us a little bit more of a background about yourself, a very extensive background. And we'll go to you in a moment, Dr. Booker. But John, kind of let us know who you are and just your extensive background in this area.
Sure. Thanks, Gavin. And it's good to be here on the traditional lands of the Eno-Shikori, the Cherokee, and the Catawba. We acknowledge all their members, past, present, and future. It's always good to be back at Furman. As I was saying to a group of students I spoke with earlier today, I come from a family of teachers, preachers, and healers. But I also come from a family of convicts, addicts, and dispossessed. And all of that is who I am and what I am. And I think it's important to acknowledge that fullness of self. Angela was talking about the past and the present and the future. I work at MDC, and MDC is an anti-poverty organization. We were born in 1967 with the goal of integrating the workforce in North Carolina and assisting in the transition to a modern economy in the state that now operates across 13 states in the South. And our focus this year has been on the past, the present, and the future. Taking a page from Frederick Douglass, who said in his speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, that America is false to the past, false to the present, and binds herself to be false to the future. We take that as a challenge. And we ask the question, what does it mean for the South to be true to the past, to be true to the present, as a way of being true to the future? For us, a true South is a thriving South. A thriving South is a South of possibility and potential. That has really marked the story of my life. It has been one of opportunity that was largely created by people like Dick Riley, who, when he was governor, funded a public education system that would make it possible for anyone in this state to truly have opportunity, to truly have choice. And that's really what I want anyone to have. And it's central to how I see the world and how I move through the world.
Very good. Thank you, John. And Dr. Booker, please.
Great. Thank you, Gavin. I want to make 2 acknowledgements before I start my comments. First of all, to Angela, thank you for being with us. As you talked about being on this journey for 50 years, working in this field of advancing equity for our community, I'm just amazed. I turned 52 last week, and I think about the 13-year journey that I've been on now as an advocate, and for you to continue this work and to maintain that level of hopefulness gives me hope to keep on running along this race. I just want to acknowledge what you've done for all of us, for these students sitting in this auditorium. I also want to acknowledge the Riley Institute. I talked about this journey, 13 years. It was in 2009 that I became a part of the Diversity Leaders Initiative here at Furman through the Riley Institute. And for those of you who don't know about this program, this opportunity, it brings together a diverse group of leaders from around the upstate, the Midlands, and the Low Country. All 3 of us have gone through that institute. 2,300 members in this community have. And it was at that moment when I really started building a foundation for what this work is all about. And that helped me in my work as a school superintendent. So I want to say a word of thanks because I really believe the 2,300 people who have gone through this institute, as we've gone through these last 2 years, it's helped us to be prepared for this moment here in South Carolina. I'm a retired school superintendent, retired educator after 28 years, 14 of those in the superintendency. In my retirement, I picked up a new career. I lead a nonprofit that's focused on building an infrastructure around our youth, an ecosystem around our youth. Because if we're really going to do what we need to do to address some of these issues that Angela has already talked about, we can't just depend on the schools to do that. It's going to take all of our adjacent sectors to be a part of that work. I'm from Spartanburg, South Carolina. Spartanburg is home. I decided to make South Carolina and Spartanburg my home. And I'm proud of where our community is right now. So in the context of my work, just to tell you a little bit about what's been going on in Spartanburg, in 2018, we published a racial equity index report. And I think David Lomanak spoke to that last week as he was talking about similar work here in Greenville. That report, while not surprising to many of us, opened the eyes for many people in our community. When you can look at one census tract for a child being born, and it's 67 years old, life expectancy, you look at this census tract, life expectancy is 85 years old. You have to ask yourself, is that really what we want for our children? So we've been on a journey in Spartanburg over the last several years to try to address those inequities. We formed a racial equity collaborative that I've been honored to have been a part of. Our city became the first city to acknowledge our past. And part of this is acknowledging our past. In September of 2020, we passed a resolution on healing, reconciliation, and unity. It was an apology resolution because that's where that work has to start, with that acknowledgement. Angela, one of the things I'll just share, and I'm going to shut up because I just want to listen to you tonight. But one of the things that I'm finding, and the reason I'm so impressed with the 50 years is because there was a moment after George Floyd when I felt like for the first time, we're going to get there this time. We're going to get there. And as the effects of COVID have continued, as time continues to pass, there are those who have been in this work who I sense are tired, and there are those who kind of threw their hat in the ring for a little while, but I see them easing off now. And I just want to be in a position to learn as much as we can learn so we can stay the course with this work. So happy to be here and honored to be on the stage with you, John and Angela.
Well, thank you, Dr. Booker. And kind of to just piggyback on that, Angela, I kind of want to jump to you. We're going to have more of a conversation here. So if you guys hear something you want to talk about, by all means, jump in and discuss it. But kind of what you were talking about, Dr. Booker, there too, with that momentum we saw last year. And then, of course, things kind of hitting a wall with the pandemic, especially. I want to talk about this phrase, the groan zone, Angela, that you've mentioned before. You kind of even touched on your introductory remarks there too about just the lack of political will, especially when we're looking at trillions of dollars of potential infrastructure investment that can help fix some inequities that we've seen over time. I just want to get your thoughts about, what that term means. Maybe people don't really know what the groan zone is and how you're seeing it play out. And if this is that time where we are seeing people needing to get the rubber on the road and actually make these differences.
Yeah, I've been involved in so many efforts, much smaller than the moment that we're in now, but efforts in which people come together to do something hard. And it starts with great enthusiasm and resolve. But because it's hard, it means it wouldn't be hard. It would have been done before if there weren't lots of reasons that people were afraid to confront it or got stuck as they were trying to do so. And when you get to that moment that it's hard, that's what we call the groan zone, because that's where people start groaning and moaning and dropping out and not coming to the meetings and reframing what they thought we were going to do. And I find that this is when leadership matters more than any other time. The groan zone is the leadership moment, because that's when you need champions. That's when you need people who will reach out to those who were there in the beginning and they're fading away and begin to understand what's causing them to fade away, create some smaller wins that we can do, put them together with somebody else who's got more enthusiasm. That's a leadership moment. But the other thing that we have to do is do our work in public, because too often when you're trying to do something hard, there is a tendency for the powerful to just go off and do it. We got to do our work in public so that the public has an expectation and will start to hold you accountable. And they're looking for return. And there's embarrassment and shame from not having done what it was you wanted to do. It's also important to develop a narrative and a story about what you're doing, and a story in which a lot of people can see themselves. This isn't just for somebody else. This is for all of us. And this is how it's going to benefit many different people. And then as you start to make progress, celebrate it, point it out, celebrate the people who are moving forward. The grown zone is actually a good place because it means there was enough momentum to get to the hard spot. And then when you get to the hard spot, you got to try all these different strategies to move through it and make some more progress. You'll hit another grown zone, but you'll have what you've done together under your belts when you do.
And John, kind of to pick up on that, thank you, Angela, for that response, is just to look at, up in Washington right now. I wouldn't say there's groans coming out of Washington. There's some noise coming out of Washington right now. I can't really classify it. But when we look at how this infrastructure bill is working its way through, we saw the Senate pass one. We saw the House now talking about the reconciliation bill. We're not going to wade into politics here too much because we want to talk about how we can change things. But what excites you about these bills? We're talking about trillions of dollars of infrastructure investment coming to communities, coming to the country. You've worked in DC before, you know how this money works. What excites you about seeing something like this?
What excites me is possibility. In the same way that Angela was describing the possibility that was partially realized with the GI Bill, that we sit poised at the edge of a moment in which we can transform our society and not just respond to the problems that are right in front of us, but to actually anticipate how we can live well and better 50 years from now. And that excites me. What the challenge is getting communities across the country to that grown zone so that they can really then begin to dig in on what they stand for, what they want collectively for the people who live there, and then how they can achieve it with these transformational resources. I used to work in the Office of Management and Budget. The typical discretionary budget for the United States government in any given year is around $900 billion. It's less than $1 trillion. And we're talking about multiples of trillions of dollars flowing from the federal government to states, municipalities, and localities. The opportunities here are tremendous, but it will require radical imagination. It will require creativity in order to be truly transformative.
I think the
Dr. Booker,
is, those dollars are earmarked for that purpose, to really lift up communities that in the past have been forgotten. I think about what's going on in our school systems and the amount of money coming in. And I worked in the school system for a long time. Typically, those dollars were so restrictive. But here we have a chance now to do some innovative things with an equity-minded focus. The challenge is the monies have to be spent soon. And it takes time to pull this level of planning together. So those communities who are positioned to get that planning done, to make sure those dollars are going to be spent in the right way are going to be those communities that are going to be farther down the road. I think the other exciting thing about this is being able to leverage those federal dollars with philanthropic dollars. And, in our philanthropic community, they are ready to come to the table to assist in those efforts. So that's a big part of the work going on right now in Spartanburg is how do we align all of these community plans into one community-wide plan that has an investment strategy that we can move forward. But the challenge is going to be helping those communities that just don't have the infrastructure and the human capital to be able to do that.
Right, because Spartanburg is a lot further down the road than a lot of other cities.
And it's been difficult, as we've looked at dozens of plans, and we're working with consultants to try to help us through this. But that is going to be the challenge
Yep.
moving forward.
And then you really talk about that rural versus urban divide, of course, gets accentuated as well. But Dr. Berg, I want to stick with you a little bit more because we have seen investment billions of dollars come to the state and around the country because of the COVID pandemic relief bills. We're talking about lawmakers having to decide how to spend $2.5 billion this fall, this month. But we've seen about $3 billion come in for education funding alone. That's about 3 times the annual allotment from the federal government. Have you been seeing anything? I know there's still plans being hashed out right now, even with education, but anything that's tangible in your what you're seeing right now happening?
Yeah, so this will be the 3rd iteration for school systems. So this is the ESSER 3 funding, which is the largest pot. And what I'm seeing right now, school districts are working on those plans currently. I did a session with 3 superintendents 2 weeks ago with the Grant Makers Network here in South Carolina. They wanted to come together to see what they could do to support our school districts. And so it's that planning piece. And they're sending information out to communities right now. They're asking parents for input. My son is going to be serving on a committee in our school system. So that input is critical. And I would just challenge our communities to make sure you're taking advantage and being at the table with that. For some of them, it's simple things like infrastructure, but this needs to be so much more. This needs to be equity minded where we can really lift those students up who in the past haven't had some of those opportunities that we talked about. And I'm talking about from birth all the way through college, not just the K-12 school system.
And Angela, I want you to jump in here too when we talk about the pandemic relief bills that we've seen help stimulate a lot of economies, keep a lot of businesses afloat, especially small businesses, especially in difficult areas. We know the minority communities have been hit harder than others. What have you seen play out so far with that money going into the communities and maybe some policies that have resulted that have been beneficial?
Well, I think what we've really seen, because it's been an unnatural period in which this money has been flowing, businesses that would have been flourishing were not, people who would have been working were not, activities that would have been going on were dormant. But what we have seen is that money can get people out of poverty. You wouldn't have thought that we would need such a massive experiment for us to be able to see that, because it seems like an obvious thing. But what we have done for child poverty is extraordinary. And when people are looking at families that are not rushing back to jobs that were not good jobs, they weren't paying enough, they didn't have enough benefits, they were having to leave their children alone too often. We are seeing that families can make good decisions for families when they have the resources to be decision makers. And I think this is the most important lesson from that. Of course, we've seen that some businesses were saved that wouldn't have been saved. But because it was such an abnormal period, the big lesson is that when we spend money and we get it to people who are most vulnerable, we can actually begin to do something about poverty. And if we do something about poverty, we can start making progress as a nation. Poverty is killing us, and it is disproportionately with people of color. 1/3 of the country lives below 200% of the poverty level. More than half of people who are Black, more than half of people who are Latinx, and 46 million white people. Poverty is killing America. And so we've learned a lot about it.
One specific example, we know higher ed plays a role in one's economic mobility outlooks. And I think about our community college with some of their dollars, tuition free now. So anyone in the upstate who wants to attend that college can go for free. Enrollment is up over 200% for returning learners. Mm-hmm. So that piece is critical. It lets you know the people want this, but the next part of it is how do we provide those wraparound services as a community to support those individuals in this work. So that's why all of this has to work together.
There's something implicit in what Russell is saying. So Russell is also an example of the fact that you can have heroes who are your age, even though he's a little bit older than I am, but he's a hero of mine because of what he does in the community in Spartanburg and what he has managed to accomplish as a superintendent. And what he's speaking to also is debt. It is the absence of debt that creates those opportunities. And all of this, including what Angela was talking about, these interventions that have indicated that it's expensive to be poor because you have to pay more in time and dollars for just about everything that you access. And if you can remove that burden, we're actually creating consumers. So if you want a capitalist system to work, create more consumers. And if you want to create more consumers, you have to end poverty. You have to lift people out of poverty. So what I think is the radical learning that has come out of this moment is that we have that within our midst. And it's possible for us to actually create an economy that is both thriving and inclusive.
Well, John, to that vein, I want to ask you just a little bit about, when we look at the potential for this investment in communities, you're seeing some backlash from people saying, oh, you're focusing on equity, you're focusing on inequality, this is anti-white investment, they're having some issues with this. How do you respond to those kind of claims that people see this as favoring one group over another, even though we know we've been paying attention to this series that it's been a historical problem, it's systemic, and it's only been the past 56 plus years where we've seen some actual growth for the community. How do you respond to those claims?
Do the hard work, and this is true of everyone within a community, do the hard work of listening to your fellow community members. I believe that community exists at the heart of this, and strong communities create strong individuals. And for those people who are concerned about being left out, being left behind, it goes to Angela's original point, the curb cut effect, that this is really about empowering everyone. And if you feel left out, take the time to listen to the stories of the people who make up your community. Understand what those individual stories mean and how they're part of a broader story. And I think that can help people to understand also why this is necessary and how it's actually going to benefit everyone.
And I think to that point, what John is saying is what we're trying to say in our community. We cannot let a national narrative drive our local work, because if we let that national narrative get in the way, it's going to stifle us. So when we focus on our data, when I talk about life expectancy, I'm talking about in 2930 blank versus this zip code. And when our churches and our communities and our organizations can see that this is home, these are the people you're in the grocery store with, these are the people who you're worshiping with, these are the people you go to school with, I think we have a better chance of getting there. But that national narrative, whether we're talking about what we're teaching our children or you name it, we can't let that drive our work at home.
And Angela, I see you nodding along there and you want to jump in?
That is such an important point, because the tagline for PolicyLink is lifting up what works. And what we are lifting up is what we find in local communities. So I have spent a lot of time in local communities all across this country with advocates and leaders, civic leaders in those places. And what you find when you go to the local community is you can really have conversations there. And when you have those conversations in local communities, when you look at the data, when you think about how wonderful it's going to be when the entire community is accessible to the entire community, and you start to be able to invest and show that and begin to share culture and share stories, it's extraordinary. I have seen communities transform themselves from inside out in that way. And I'm afraid that we have too much national narrative because of MSNBC and CNN and Fox, that people jump from that to thinking that that's about their lives, as opposed to when it used to be you watched your local news and you got an impression of what was happening in your local community. But people are having too much shaped by national narrative that it's drowning out the really uplifting stories of what's happening very close in.
Angela, thank you for repping local news. I love that. And that's the reason I have a podcast, the South Carolina Lead, because we want to focus on those local stories. People don't know that they have local representation. City, county council, that's where it really matters. State House is also important too, but they think they just have, Lindsey Graham or Tim Scott. They don't realize that they have a state senator, state rep who they're now deciding what to do with $2.5 billion coming to this state. And Angela, I want to stick with you, just talk about these challenges. I mean, you talked about the political will, you talked about the headaches and the bumps. How do you see this making sure that this is deployed strategically and that it's done in a cohesive manner, at least, so we can get the most out of this potential investment?
Well, PolicyLink is very involved in this. We actually worked with the administration to help craft that first executive order that called for doing a racial equity audit. And we have been working with the administration to understand across all of the agencies how to be able to think about doing a racial equity audit and how to think about measuring progress. And we really are doubling down, hoping that the infrastructure dollars will be the first test of how to do that. Russell is certainly right when he talks about the role that philanthropy is playing right now, because philanthropy across the country, including community foundations all across the country, are understanding that they have to invest in the capacity of their local communities to make good on this promise, that we have to build the capacity for engagement, the capacity for planning, the capacity for being able to measure and hold accountable. And I see lots of those kind of efforts going forward. But to get back to when we were talking earlier about some communities aren't quite ready, and the ones that are most ready are going to be able to take advantage of these infrastructure investments. What we have to do is have a commitment to, no matter what dollars are spent, we are going to get racial equity outcomes. So it doesn't matter what you choose to do. It could be light rail. It could be drain water management. It could be broadband. It could be dealing with infrastructure around downtown development. It doesn't matter what you're doing. You have to think about who is going to get the jobs. How is it going to be the potential for advancement? Are we putting these things in places where we're going to be able to see benefit to those who are being left behind? There is a way to make sure that every penny that's spent is a racial equity penny.
Mhm. Thank you, Angela. And John, I want to talk to you really quick, not just about racial equity, but about health equity. Obviously, we are talking about infrastructure, we're talking about roads, bridges, but there's also the need for health infrastructure too in our country, addressing the inequities in health and healthcare and access to healthy food, receiving high quality education. You spent some time at Prisma Health focusing on the issue of health and wellness. What did that teach you about how we can address health inequities right now, especially when you look at the potential for this investment?
It's an interesting question, Gavin, because when I was at Prisma, my work was mainly about connecting clinicians to community, and doing so in a way so that clinicians could better understand their patient population. Their patient population could more easily navigate a healthcare system, and we get better outcomes all around by intervening earlier in the health prospects for those patients. I also thought that we could rally people around the idea that you don't want to see anyone else suffer, that you wouldn't want to see someone suffer the effects, the chronic effects of diabetes or hypertension, to lose a leg, to lose a limb. And now I don't know if that's true.
Exactly.
Because what I see is a gross lack of concern. Even at the institutional level, where an institution could mandate that everyone who works in that institution is vaccinated if they're providing healthcare, and chooses not to do so. It speaks to what we prioritize and what we value. And we can get to this later, but I think there's a corollary to that question is, what do we owe each other? And I think in this instance, we owe each other the ability to conduct lives that are lived with dignity. And the current investments in public health don't really privilege dignity.
Yeah, I'm wondering why we have gotten to that point where we don't have that dignity anymore. Dr. Booker, do you want to jump in about why we need to rebuild the community just on a larger level as a nation?
Yeah, well, to John's point, when we talk about health, all of these other indicators are determinants of health. When I talk about educational attainment, right now, baccalaureate degree attainment in our community is low. So that's one of the big areas we're focusing on at the Spartanburg academic movement. We talk about, baccalaureate degree attainment, and so forth in terms of building a strong economy, building a strong workforce. But when you look at the data at a deeper level and you look at economic mobility and life expectancy, those things are also tied to educational attainment. So it's not just a matter of the economy. All of these things that we're talking about are true determinants of one's health outcomes. And that's why, to Angela's point with, let's just do something that focuses on racial equity. That will lead to better health outcomes. We've got to stop treating the problem and really start focusing on some of these root causes.
Having conversations like this and reaching out and understanding and educating each other. Did you have something to say, John? Or? Okay. Well, we have our last question before we get to our audience questions. And Angela, I want to start with you, and we're going to kind of end on a hopeful note here. And just kind of what keeps you hopeful right now? What's getting you through this grown zone, this time? We think about Heather McGee and her call to come together in solidarity, because it is only through coming together that we can build a better country for us all. It's a little daunting these days with a lot of the anger, a lot of the rhetoric out there, but what's giving you hope going forward?
There's much to worry about, but the fact that more people in positions of influence and power are making it their highest priority to understand how we got to this moment of extraordinary difference that you can identify by race and figure out how to move toward racial equity gives me tremendous hope. The other thing that gives me hope is this notion of transformative solidarity, that people are seeing their common interest in being able to move to a different place as we move forward. That coming together not as an ally, but with ownership of the problem. I'm not an ally to help you with your problem, but I am owning our collective problem. I'm hearing that more than I ever have. Those two things give me hope.
John, how about you?
The fact that we're having this conversation gives me hope. And the fact that we are now listening to more stories than we've heard before. Angela spoke about narrative earlier, and narrative is important in the work that we do at MDC in community, specifically beginning with individual narrative and learning the stories of individuals within the community, how those individual stories then create a common narrative, a commonly held narrative that identifies what those individuals stand for and the key questions that they want to live out. And we're in a moment where maybe collectively we're in the grown zone because this is a difficult time, but it's not one in which we've given up. It's not one in which we've run away. My background is in constitutional design, and that was all shaped by an experience living in South Africa during the transition to democracy in 1994. What I saw then gives me hope, because I know that a group of people organized around a collective common purpose can truly transform not only their lives individually, but their lives collectively.
And Dr. Booker.
Yeah, so I'm looking at these students out here, and you all give me hope. I've got an 18-year-old senior in high school, Black male, and I've got a 20-year-old junior in college in the Maryland area, Black male. And my wife and I will sit around the table having these conversations, and we're tired at times, we're frustrated. And as it gets on their nerves. So they have to ground us at times and keep us in check, because their experiences hadn't necessarily been my experiences. Mine hadn't necessarily been Angela's experiences. But my son came home from a series last night from college, called us and said, the speaker talked to us about diversity and equity and inclusion. And it was the president at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And my son said, everybody listened, not a soul walked out feeling like we had been divided. And that's what our youth are looking for us to do. And that gives me hope that they're remaining hopeful, but we've got to be a model for them so they can finish this work.
Very well said. Dr. Booker, I want to stick with you with these audience questions. We have several good ones. This question is a little bit more specific to the state, so we're going to focus there. How can we assure that investment dollars will reach the corridor of shame and not just, the Spartanburg, Greenville, Columbia, Charleston areas that we always hear about? I worked in Florence County for 4 years. I'm aware of everyone always feeling neglected if they're not one of the big cities in the state, but again, that rural, urban, and
Yeah.
especially the corridor of shame.
Absolutely. So let me just first of all say, it is called the corridor of shame, not because that's a shameful community. It's called the corridor of shame because it's a shame with how we let that community get to the point to where it is right now. And people get so confused about that. The investments are going there. I think what we've got to ensure is that we've built enough capacity. So, that superintendent that's in that district that has to wear 30 hats has some capacity to really be able to stop and think and plan and pull the community together. And here we are with this investment right now, but our superintendents and our principals and our teachers, they are worried about matters of, whether or not if I teach this history lesson, people are going to show up at the board meeting fussing because you're talking about race. They're dealing with us bickering about whether or not you need to wear a mask right now or not. So we've got to put our arms around these communities and our school systems, especially in areas where they don't have a lot of the capacity to even stop to be able to do this planning. So I think we're going to need our philanthropic community, our state leaders, and everybody's going to have to give them some time to pause and plan.
Yeah, and as when it comes to that money, I have talked to the state superintendent of education, and districts do have to submit plans to the State Department of Education to get approved for those funds to be distributed. And it's just a matter of trying to maximize the potential impact there for sure. Angela, this question's for you. The listeners, thank you for all that you've done and wants to know an example about a community that has been energized, a community that maybe has been typically left out. If you had an example of them getting themselves out of poverty that maybe gives you some inspiration or that we can look to as a role model.
I'm going to tell you a story of Richmond, California. Richmond, California was really suffering under extraordinary violence that was happening in the community, killing way too many young Black men in that community. And a program started there called Advance Peace. And what Advance Peace did was it got young people, young men who were shooters in the community and got them into a fellowship program in which they committed to do things. It might have been as simple as stop smoking or as big as get out of the gang, but whatever they said they were going to do, they did it and they got resources. They got maybe $500 for that month. And then on a regular basis, then they got into internships. They reduced gun violence in a way I wish I had the numbers for you. I don't have them. You will be shocked if you could see them. You could go on Radical Imagination and listen to the Advanced Peace podcast and hear about the reduction in gun violence. And not only did they have a reduction in gun violence, but recidivism went way down. That is an example of a community coming together, focusing and making a difference. I can give similar examples with concrete in terms of getting jobs, in terms of graduating from high school, anything that you can point to, I can point to a community where they have tackled it. What we need to do is take these interventions to scale so that all children can benefit from them.
Russell, I see you nodding along, making some gestures. Did you want to jump in on that?
No, I'm
too?
just saying, amen, that's all.
Yeah. John, I want to ask you, just given the current racial climate right now, what group, whether it's generational, regional, racial, what group do you think is the best target audience for future change?
The best target audience for future change.
Yes.
It's got to be the group that's right in front of me. I think that what they're living through right now is extraordinary. And I said this to the group of students that I spoke to earlier today. We shouldn't discount the fact of what you all have been able to endure, and that in spite of all of those challenges, you are here, you're having a college experience, you are pursuing an education, and you will take these experiences with you into your life. I'm a child of the post-civil rights era. That's what shaped me. But you all are being shaped by this confluence of a pandemic, climate change, and what continues to be our grappling with our addiction to race and racism in this country. The solutions that you generate are ones that we can't even imagine. And that gives me a lot of hope. because I know that it's possible, and I know that the level of creativity that exists in younger generations will far exceed whatever it is that we could propose at the moment.
Very well said. Dr. Booker, I want to stick with you about education. What is the role of public schools and education policies in the advancement of racial and economic equity? How can we use education to advance quality, especially when the most disadvantaged children tend to be in disadvantaged schools and therefore stuck in a cycle of inequality? How do we break that cycle, it sounds like?
Who asked that question?
No, they're out there if they're online.
So there was a lot in that.
Yes.
What I will say, and this will be somewhat broad, and I apologize for that because there's a lot in that question. From my own experience as a student, growing up here in the South, I didn't learn my story growing up. I thought my story, because all I saw in me was, Black men playing sports or entertaining. And there were things I couldn't see as a student until I got older. It's so important that our leaders understand the systems in which they're working. If I would have known the things I know now as a teacher, I would have taught a little differently. If I would have known the things I know now as a principal, I would have led my school a different way. I learned a lot during my time as a superintendent. So there's still so much that I think we don't understand. And when we talk about systemic racism, I used to get offended when people would say that there's systemic racism in schools, because here I was leading a district. And in my mind, what I was hearing is that you've got a school system full of racists. And that's not what they were saying. I have to admit now that our system was built around this whole notion of racism. And it wasn't too long ago. 1970, when we integrated finally in Spartanburg 7, that wasn't too long ago. And even the way we integrated, now that I understand integration, as peaceful as it was, our Black community lost some things in integration because it was, you come join us instead of us, having a mutual integration. So I would just say it's so important that our leaders learn and understand what the system is all about. And I mentioned it's a 13-year journey for me. It should have started a long time ago, understanding the impacts of race and equity.
And just before we leave, just to keep with that, Dr. Booker, are you worried about the way that we continue to have this discussion about critical race theory? And maybe it's not even a discussion these days, it's more of a shouting match and people getting confused and weaponizing it to the point where maybe we're not even going to be able to talk about race in schools when we need to be talking about it more than ever, just like you said, not being taught that story growing up.
Yeah, I'm worried. There was an article in our local paper today where teachers don't even know what to teach now. And that is a part of our history. So yeah, I'm absolutely worried about that national narrative because, on one hand, we talk about we don't want to make people feel guilty and shame people by having conversations about race. But here I was, a little Black boy sitting in class, never seeing myself in anything. And just thinking about what that did to me growing up. So we've just got to get to a level of understanding. I talk about, this pandemic, and I know we've got to go. All the things we've been told to do during this pandemic, do them, but we've got to undo that. We've got to get proximate with one another, as Brian Stevenson says, instead of socially distancing. We've got to take these masks off and be real and authentic with one another. We've got to extend grace to one another instead of washing our hands, and we've got to get out of our bubble. And that's what I want to challenge everybody to do as we try to move forward. And when we get here, now we've got a vaccine, people need to finish the work. And that's what I want to see our community do.
It's a great note to end on right there, everyone. Thank you to John, Russell, Angela. It has been an honor to share the stage with all of you. Thank you so much for joining us On behalf of South Carolina ETV, the Riley Institute, and Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Furman, thank you to all who have joined us tonight. We look forward to seeing you next year at Straight Talk 2022.